Hello, my name is David Bethea. I'm Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm here to say a few words about our new English language translation of Yuri Lotman's classic biography of Alexander Pushkin, Russia's greatest poet and cultural figure. Now, why is this book timely today, and what can it say to contemporary readers? First of all, the Russian brand obviously has suffered in recent years and has undergone a certain amount of self-examination and questioning, which is correct, which is useful. Pushkin is at the center of that cultural consciousness. He is at the center because his poetry started the modern period in Russian literature and Russian culture, and all of the great figures that came out of that in the 19th century, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Turgenev, Chekhov, Gogol, they all go back to Pushkin in a way that seems almost consanguineous, that they seem almost related to Pushkin. They acknowledge Pushkin. His poetry, its sound and its sense together, its rhyme and its rhythm together, created a kind of core that for the Russians epitomized who they were. It spoke to them in a special way at a time when poetry was still ascendant. So, what is arguably Pushkin's most famous work, Eugene Onegin, is a novel in verse. In effect, it's a novel made up of hundreds of little lyric poems, which are like sonnets that tell a story at the same time. This spoke to Russians in very personal ways. The characters in the novel, like Tatyana and Onegin and Lensky, they became figures that were then repeated in Russian culture throughout the 19th century in different forms. Tatyana became the quintessential Russian heroine who maintains her integrity and still loves Onegin at the end of the novel, but refuses to leave her husband and run off with Onegin, even though she has feelings for him. And she has changed, just like Pushkin has changed, from the young maiden early on in the novel who falls head over heels in love with Onegin and gives her heart to him in a letter. Then, at the end of the novel, when the hero Onegin writes a similar letter to her, she must respond that the time is no longer right, that I am going to remain true to myself, and this temperament of the strong Russian woman would be repeated thereafter in a lot of the heroines in Turgenev and Tolstoy, that it became a kind of prototype for subsequent Russian novels, important Russian novels. So, Pushkin is the source. He's the father figure. And at this time when the Russian brand is experiencing some difficulties, everything goes through transition and change, it's important for us to understand where the roots of Russian culture, where they came from and how they evolved. And Pushkin is central to that. And this book by Yuri Lotman explains in the most convincing, thorough, erudite detail what the historical context for the appearance of Pushkin was, both on a personal basis and especially on a social, political, and larger state basis, how he came out of his society, in this case St. Petersburg society, how he emerged from that. Pushkin is always represents something that's a kind of secret to Russian culture. He has been almost untranslatable into English language poetry, which we sense, which we feel is Pushkin at the same time. It often comes across as kind of bad Victorian poetry. But Pushkin's poetry is always alive, it's always precise, it's incredibly musical and beautiful to listen to. And out of that poetry then emerge these other forms. Out of the poetry comes Pushkin's fairy tales. Eventually, Pushkin's own short tales, his novel in verse, eventually his historical novel, his history writing. Everything started with the poetry and his muse and his sense of being inspired to become a poet. His identity is as a poet, and Russians identify their greatest cultural figure as a poet, and so they see that there's something poetic in themselves, a kind of spiritual substrate that they identify with poetry. Lotman's biography gives us a fuller, more accurate, thoughtful, reasoned, deep picture of Pushkin and where he came from and where the great works of 19th century Russian literature came from than any other source we have. And so for that reason, if you love Russian literature and Russian culture, then this is a book that you should read first. Thank you.